In the shadow of oblivion and ridicule, veteran Captain Casey Dunn returns to her military base in a worn-out uniform, not for glory, but on a silent mission. Her former involvement in the secretive Ashfall unit becomes the key to uncovering a conspiracy and saving a future generation of soldiers. This is a story about the power of experience, the danger of overconfidence, and the price of silence. Welcome to my channel. I hadn't worn that uniform in nearly a decade, not since the day I left active duty behind. The colors had dulled to a smoky gray, the threads around the sleeves had begun to fray, and the insignias were more memory than decoration. But I put it on that morning without hesitation. Not for attention, not for nostalgia. Just because. Some weight I couldn't explain pulled it out of the storage chest that night, and I followed that pull. I was headed to Fort Harrow, an inland base in northern Colorado known more for its cold breakfast than any strategic significance. There was a multi-division logistics conference being held, a bland name for a high-stakes internal reassessment of operational doctrine. I was there as a consulting logistics advisor. On paper, in person, I was something else entirely. Something they didn't know. At 43, I knew I didn't fit the look of the modern military elite anymore. I'd aged out of the gleaming confidence and tech-savvy swagger these young officers wore like a second skin. My name is Casey Dunn, former captain of Task Unit Ashfall, an outfit that never officially existed. After Operation Silent Flame, we were scattered to the wind. A choice we all made. For reasons that no one outside the highest security clearances could ever understand. I stepped into the officers' dining hall just after sunrise. You could have heard a fork drop when I walked in. Conversations cut short. I scanned my faded nameplate. I didn't expect a parade, but I also didn't expect the sneering whispers. Somebody forget to tell Grandma Halloween's over, one lieutenant muttered from the buffet line, loud enough for me to hear. She even got the old-school boots on, another snickered. That's a museum exhibit, right? I ignored them. Sat at the back. Coffee. Black. I opened my little notebook, same one I'd kept since my first deployment. The pages were thin and curled at the edges, filled with sketches, diagrams, field notes, and in more recent years, names. Observations. Not out of spite, but because I learned something critical over the years. What people reveal when they think you don't matter says more than they ever intend. One sergeant, as barely older than mine had been when I joined, came up with the kind of smile you wear when you're about to deliver a veiled insult. "Ma'am," he said, "are you sure you're in the right place?" I looked up, smiled. Pretty sure. He didn't expect me to say anything at all, so that was enough to send him back to his friends shaking his head. They didn't know. They couldn't know. About the emblem. A tiny black triangle, stitched almost invisibly on my left shoulder, outlined with barely their silver. Most would have assumed it was a faded patch from some forgotten training division. But those who knew? They never forgot it. The young officers thought I was just logistics support. A desk filler with a dated haircut. And that was fine. Until they started getting bold. At the pre-conference social that evening, I stood near the wall, out of the way. Watching. Listening. The chatter was arrogant, loud, self-congratulatory. One young captain with too many ribbons and not enough scars noticed me. "You might actually learn something from us tonight, ma'am," he said with a wide grin. "We operate a little differently than your era did." He waited for a laugh from his peers. Got one. "Of course," he added with a theatrical shrug. "Studying how the old guard failed does help us avoid their mistakes." That stung, but I didn't flinch. I met his eyes. Didn't say a word. That silence? It wasn't indifference. It was endurance. They didn't realize that some of us survived hell not by shouting, but by listening, by watching, by waiting for the moment when silence turned into power. And that moment was coming. The morning of the main conference opened with fanfare, brass buttons polished to a mirror finish, projection screens lit with the words "Future Operations in a Changing Battlefield," and a young colonel named Bryce Ellison standing at the podium like he'd just won a talent show. Colonel Ellison was exactly the kind of officer who rose fast in peacetime. Bright, articulate, sharp-jawed. He wore his lack of combat experience like a feature instead of a flaw, always referring to doctrinal advances and integrated simulations like he was selling a startup pitch to generals. I took my seat quietly at the far back corner of the conference hall, notebook on my lap, pen in hand. I watched, listened, made notes. Around me, officers mingled during coffee breaks. One group, all in their early 30s, lingered by the vending machines. They weren't whispering this time. "You see that woman in the back?" said one. "The antique." "Exactly. Still using paper." Probably thinks drones are science fiction. The laughter wasn't even muffled anymore. It echoed. My pen didn't stop. I jotted down their names. Badges were easy to read when people weren't trying to hide their contempt. It didn't matter to them that I had sat in cold dirt for 3 days with a heartbeat so slow I could hear worms moving. That I had led 6 silent extractions from hostile territory with no backup. They saw the outside, worn uniform, weathered face, no medals on display, and assumed irrelevance. Then came Colonel Ellison's big talk. We honor our history, he said smoothly, but we don't let it dictate our future. He paced confidently. Let's not sugarcoat it. The old methodologies? Outdated. The past? Valuable only for its cautionary tales. He looked around the room like a stage actor preparing for his big monologue. And then he saw me. And yet, he added with a sharp grin, some seem to believe that presence equals relevance. The room followed his gaze. Every face turned toward me. I didn't move. Ellison was on a roll now. What matters today is innovation, not reputation. And sometimes, he said, the best thing the older generation can do is simply step aside. I stood. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel the shift in air pressure. And every eye watched as I turned toward Ellison, not with anger, but with something colder. Stillness. I appreciate the reminder, Colonel, I said calmly, my voice clear and steady. Because sometimes the best thing the younger generation can do is realize they don't know what they don't know. Then I sat. Ellison didn't have a retort. He blinked, laughed awkwardly, moved on. The audience sat frozen in that awkward silence that follows when someone realizes they've just poked a sleeping bear. 10 minutes later, the conference doors opened again, and in walked General Mason Rourke, base commander, a man with more scars than skin, known across the mountain posts for one thing. He didn't tolerate disrespect. He nodded at Ellison but didn't sit. He was scanning, searching. His eyes swept the crowd and landed on me. And in that moment, I saw his face change. From neutral to recognition. He didn't say a word. He just stared at the patch on my shoulder. The silver triangle glinting faintly in the fluorescent light. His jaw clenched. His posture shifted. And I knew what was coming. You don't forget the emblem of a unit that never existed. You don't forget the face of someone who walked through fire to keep others breathing. Not if you're General Mason Rourke. Not if you were one of the ones we pulled out of a black site collapse on the Afghan border in 17. He turned to Ellison. Colonel, he said, voice low but clear, halt your presentation. But, sir. Now. Ellison stepped aside, confusion and irritation crossing his face. Rourke spoke to the room, but his eyes never left me. Captain Dunn, he said slowly, formally. I need a word. In private. Now. Every whisper in the room stopped. People glanced at each other, then back to me. And as I stood again, stepping toward the front of the room, I didn't need their apologies. I didn't want them. What was coming next wasn't for me. It was for them. The briefing room door hissed shut behind us, locking with that distinct magnetic seal reserved for top-level discussions. I stood there, hands at my sides, the fabric of my uniform whispering as I moved. Rourke didn't speak at first. He paced the perimeter of the room like he was walking a perimeter in his mind, brushing against ghosts only he could see. Casey Dunn, he said at last, the name escaping like a breath he'd been holding for years. Ashfall. I nodded once. He leaned forward, both hands on the cold steel table between us, eyes locked to mine. You shouldn't exist. That makes 2 of us, I said evenly. He exhaled through his nose. Not a laugh. Something heavier. I read the debrief. Silent Flame. You were reported Kia. Technically, that was accurate. The old me didn't make it out. He studied me, trying to reconcile the faded fabric and quiet presence with the specter from his classified reports. Then he walked to a secured terminal, entered a code only 4 people in the Western Hemisphere still had clearance to use, and pulled up a file marked Class 7. Ashfall, echo silence. My photo popped up. Younger. Blood-streaked. Standing in the background of a grainy satellite frame taken moments before our exfil chopper arrived. You led the southern flank during Silent Flame, Rourke said, more to himself than me. Intercepted a rogue supply route. Took down a warlord who didn't officially exist. I nodded again. He scrolled through the record. Entries redacted so heavily they looked like blackout poems. And then nothing. No discharge, no reassignment. Just a final note. Decomplete. You were buried with the operation. It was the deal, I said. 3 of us walked out. We agreed, disappear. Live quiet. Never speak of it again. And yet here you are. I met his gaze. I was never hiding. Just serving differently. He looked down at the emblem again, then back at me. You realize that thing on your shoulder is still triggering silent alerts. Last time it showed up, Joint Command spun up an intel review in under 8 minutes. I'm aware. Why wear it now? Because your base, I said, has forgotten what it means to listen. That made him stop. I pulled the notebook from my jacket and laid it on the table. Opened it. Pages filled with names, phrases, moments. Not to shame. To remember. They think experience is a relic, I said. They mistake silence for absence. Rourke sat. Slowly. And what do you want, Captain? Nothing, I said. Not for me. But your officers need to understand what it costs when you trade wisdom for arrogance. I'm not asking for a stage. Just a position. I'll teach. Quietly. They won't know what I've done. Only what I've learned. Rourke rubbed his face, stared at the screen again, then back at me. I could assign you as senior tactical advisor under non-disclosure. Your service remains sealed. Your authority, however, would be visible. I said nothing, but my answer was in my eyes. And Ellison? He asked. I gave him a half-smile. Let him teach what he's learned. I'll fill in what he hasn't. Rourke chuckled, a short, humorless sound. This base doesn't deserve you, he muttered. No, I agreed. But it needs me. He stood, extending his hand. Then welcome back. Captain. I shook it. The metal ring on his right hand clinked against my worn knuckles. It's good to be useful again. As we stepped out of the secure room and back into the corridor, the silence outside felt loaded. Officers glanced up. Conversations died mid-sentence. Rourke didn't explain a thing. He just walked with me, step for step, toward the conference room. When we reached the door, he paused. You ready for this? I gave him a look. I've been ready since before they were born. The room was dead quiet when we walked back in. Colonel Ellison still stood at the podium, but his posture had shifted. Stiff. Guarded. Like a man trying to replay his last few sentences in his head and realizing too late how badly he'd misjudged the room. General Rourke stepped up beside him, didn't even glance at the screen behind him still frozen on a slide labeled Operational Innovation, breaking from the past. He turned to the crowd, hands behind his back. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, I'd like to introduce your new senior tactical advisor for special operations training. He gestured to me. Captain Casey Dunn. There was a moment, half gasp, half silence, that moved like a wave across the room. Some tried to hide their surprise. Others didn't bother. I caught the twitch in Ellison's eye. Confusion. Then defensiveness. Then something else. Something like fear. She will be revising our field training curriculum effective immediately, Rourke continued. And I expect every single one of you to treat her with the same respect you'd give to any superior officer in this chain of command. He paused. Because if you don't, he said, turning slowly, you'll answer to me. Ellison opened his mouth, closed it, then finally spoke. General, with all due respect, what qualifies her for this? Rourke tilted his head. Are you really asking that? Ellison stiffened. We don't have record of her recent deployments. Her file is lacking in detail. I took a step forward. You're right, I said. It is. Ellison turned toward me, trying to recover. Then how are we to assess her? You're not, I cut in. You're to learn from me. A ripple moved through the crowd again, this time not derision, but something new. Rourke narrowed his eyes. Colonel, I suggest you sit. And listen. Ellison sat. And the sound that followed wasn't silence. It was something deeper. Respect being recalibrated in real time. I stood at the edge of the podium, facing the officers who had mocked me, dismissed me, written me off like an old memo. You think experience looks like a sharp crease and a LinkedIn profile, I said quietly. But out there, in the dirt, in the dark, in the places you pretend to train for, experience has no name tag. No resume. I held up my notebook. This, I said, this is your warning. I've been writing down every time one of you dismissed wisdom, not to punish, but to teach. The notebook snapped shut like a final word. And that lesson starts now. I stepped down from the podium and returned to my seat. Didn't need a round of applause. Didn't want one. What I needed was for the silence to do the work. And it did. By the time the session ended, no one was whispering behind my back. They were whispering to each other, trying to make sense of what they'd seen, who I was, what they'd missed. And Colonel Ellison? He didn't look at me when he left the room. He looked at the floor. 3 days later, Fort Harrow didn't look the same. You'd think a base couldn't change in that short a time. But culture? Culture shifts in moments. One spark, and the whole system has to reckon with its own weight. It started subtly. Officers who had once laughed now greeted me with tight nods. Others stopped by my office just to ask a quick question, but they lingered. They wanted something. Not credentials. Not medals. They wanted to understand how I'd done it, how I'd earned that unspoken authority. I didn't tell war stories. I didn't name-drop operations or flex my past. Instead, I started where I always do, with mistakes. How many of you have gotten someone hurt because you followed the book instead of your gut? I asked during the first training session. Blank stares. Then, one hand. Then 3. That was all I needed. This isn't about teaching you how to be heroes, I told them. It's about making sure you don't get your team killed because you were too proud to admit what you didn't know. They leaned in. Not out of obligation, out of need. Colonel Ellison didn't show up for the first 2 days. Rumor was he'd been reassigned to desk work pending leadership review. Official channels said nothing. Unofficial ones said everything. You could feel the shame bleeding off his absence like heat from concrete. By the 4th day, I found a note on my desk. Written in tight, nervous penmanship. Captain Dunn. I would like to speak with you privately. I was wrong. B. Ellison. I left it unopened for most of the day. That night, I found him waiting outside the training field, jacket zipped to his chin, hands shoved in his pockets like a cadet reporting for punishment. Colonel, I said as I approached. He straightened. I owe you an apology, he began. You owe it to yourself, I said. But I'll hear it. He looked down, embarrassed. I thought I knew what leadership looked like. I thought modern meant better. I waited. I forgot that humility's part of command, he added. I forgot that the quiet ones might be carrying the loudest lessons. I watched him for a second, then nodded. You don't need to explain your arrogance, I said. You need to replace it. He met my gaze. I'm ready to learn, he said simply. That was enough. We walked side by side in silence for a while. No formalities. No lectures. Just a recognition between two people who had finally stepped into the same world, one that required more than rank to navigate. As the wind picked up, I reached for my sleeve, adjusting the corner where the silver triangle lay. You ever wonder what it costs to carry a secret so heavy it bends your posture? I asked. Ellison nodded. I do now. I didn't smile. But I didn't need to. The lesson had landed. The wind off the mountains rolled in heavy that evening, rattling the glass in my office window as I sat with the lights off, staring at a name I hadn't spoken aloud in nearly 10 years. Reyes. The syllables felt like metal in my mouth, cool, sharp, weathered. He was one of the 3 of U.S. who walked out of Operation Silent Flame alive. The intel officer. The voice of reason. The one who always found the back door when there wasn't supposed to be one. He became a librarian in Nevada. Changed his last name. Quiet. Vanished like we all promised we would. The other? Kincaid. She ran our comms, but she could shoot straighter than most ground units. Last I heard, she worked as a fire lookout somewhere near Glacier National Park. A tower, a radio, a long silence between transmissions. None of us had spoken since the day we stood on that airstrip, dust coating our tongues, the mission behind us, and a fake funeral ahead. We agreed to vanish. We agreed to serve in silence. But silence gets heavy. A month into my new role, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Not the pull. Not the ache. Not the unfinished stories we'd tried to bury. I went to the comms room at Fort Harrow. Quiet. After hours. I used an old frequency, one not used in years. One they'd never expect anyone to remember. The radio crackled. I adjusted the dial. This is Dunn. Ashfall 07. To units 03 and 09. This is a wellness check. Confirm alive. Silence. Then a pause. Then 09. Reading. Fireline is clear. My heart nearly stopped. Kincaid. Another long beat. Then 03. Library's closed, but I'm still standing. Reyes. I sat down. Hard. 10 years of silence cracked like old leather. They were still out there. Alive. I didn't say much. Didn't need to. Just one thing. I took the patch off the inside. They knew what I meant. For years, I'd kept the emblem sewn beneath the sleeve, hidden. This time, I wore it on the outside. That silence on the other end? It wasn't fear. It was understanding. They didn't ask why I did it. They knew. And in that shared pause, across states, across scars, we became a unit again, just for a breath. I turned off the radio. Didn't cry. Didn't smile. Just whispered, still serving. Because some missions don't end. Some just go quiet for a while. The call came at 0432. An emergency alert cracked through my comms, intermittent, garbled. A field training unit had gone silent during a remote nighttime exercise in the Granite Sector, 20 miles west of base. Mountain terrain. Dense tree cover. Zero visibility without infrared. I was dressed before the final echo of static left the speaker. By 0445, I was at the tactical center, where young officers, usually so loud and sure, now stood pale and fidgeting. Colonel Whitman briefed me in short, clipped sentences. Unit Delta 7. 10 cadets. 1 junior commander. Last check-in at 0200. Then, nothing. He gestured to a wall screen. Coordinates were here when we lost signal. Weather system just rolled in. They've likely lost GPS radios jammed. I nodded, processing. Rescue. They're staging, but the weather's slowed airlift. Ground team ETA is 2 hours. I looked at the terrain overlay. Fog banks rolling in hard from the north. A drop in barometric pressure. Storm forming fast. We were about to lose all visibility, maybe power. No drones would get through that mess. Whitman leaned in, voice low. You think this is a glitch? I shook my head. No. This is contact. He stiffened. You mean? Unfriendly, intentional, and trained. Someone jammed them. That's not a storm issue. His face went pale. But this is a training zone. No one's. Doesn't matter. You don't wait for confirmation in this scenario. You move. I pulled on my field coat and reached for the old go bag I hadn't used since the Southern Rim deployments. Wait, Captain. Whitman called after me. You're not cleared to. I'm already 10 years overdue for clearance, sir. I was gone before he could protest. I took a single vehicle and drove into the fog line, wheels crunching over gravel until I had to go on foot. The storm curled around the trees like smoke, thick enough to lose the trail. But I'd been in worse. I moved fast, following an instinct that was less about maps and more about patterns. After a mile, I found a dropped flare casing still warm. Another quarter mile in, I found them. Pinned. The cadets were clustered near a rocky outcrop, sheltering behind overturned gear. Their squad leader, Lieutenant Bray, was bleeding from a gash across his forehead. Their comms unit was a shattered mess of metal and sparks. 2 figures in dark camo moved through the fog ahead, geared to advance for any friendly exercise. Not a drill. I didn't wait. I slid into cover and pulled out a signal mirror, angled it low. 2 quick flashes. Then silence. It was the old signal. Ashfall code 4, observe. Do not return fire. Bray saw me. His eyes widened, then sharpened. He tapped 2 of his cadets, gave a silent count, and nodded. I moved around the flank, low, tight, careful. The enemy was exfiltrating, slowly, quietly, as if they hadn't expected resistance. They didn't see me until it was too late. 3 minutes. That's all it took. The last one ran. I let him go. We needed someone to leave a trail. Back at the cadet position, the young soldiers stared at me like I was a ghost. You're done, one whispered. I nodded. You're all alive. That's what matters. I patched up Bray's head, checked their injuries, and radioed in a coded pulse through my emergency transmitter. Rescue came 40 minutes later. By then, the fog had lifted. But something else had changed too. Respect didn't come in medals or commands that day. It came in the way those cadets followed my voice through the dark without question. It came in their silence. The right kind of silence this time. The debrief lasted 6 hours. I sat across from a panel of officers and intelligence liaisons flown in from Peterson Command. General Rourke flanked me like a shield, but I didn't need one. The evidence spoke louder than any words I could offer. The attackers were confirmed, rogue ex-military contractors. Trained. Equipped. Former allies now turned private mercs for hire. Intel was still piecing together the why, but the how was clear. Someone had mapped our training cycles and planned the ambush to test a response window. A probe. And they almost succeeded until I stepped in. The cadets' testimonies had traveled up the chain fast. Phrases like surgical efficiency and ghost precision kept coming up. But it was General Rourke's words that carried the most weight. She didn't just prevent casualties. She redefined the protocol under fire. These cadets saw what it meant to adapt in chaos. Something you can't teach in a classroom. They offered me a medal. I declined. I didn't do it for that, I said. I did it because they deserved to come home. Still, things moved quickly after that. Fort Harrow's Ops Command was shaken up. New security clearances were issued. Quiet investigations were opened across several contractor networks. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Someone was building a list of vulnerable training cycles, remote exercises, bases with soft response windows, and someone inside the system had provided that data. A mole. One night, I found a file folder slid under my office door. No note. Just a single paperclip holding together 4 surveillance photos. 3 of them were of me. Entering base. Training cadets. Exiting the field. The 4th? Kincaid. Taken from a long distance, near a fire tower. I stared at it until my hands went cold. That was no coincidence. Whoever was targeting us, they knew. Not just about Fort Harrow. About Ashfall. They weren't after the base. They were after the remnants of a unit that was never supposed to exist. I knew what I had to do. I re-established the old comms channel. This is done. Ashfall 07. Code black. Confirm status. Silence for several seconds. Then, 09. Tower secure. Message received. Then, 03. Eyes open. They're hunting. I exhaled. We were all awake now. The ghosts of Operation Silent Flame had just become someone's target list. We weren't hiding anymore. We were preparing. By the end of that week, I'd remapped Fort Harrow's entire emergency response grid. The officers thought I was just enhancing protocol. What I was really doing was building an exit strategy. Not for me. For them. Because I knew what was coming. And I knew who would suffer if we weren't ready. I looped Rourke in. Quietly. He didn't blink. Just asked how he could help. Start acting normal, I told him. Let them think we're unaware. The plan was simple. Don't provoke. Don't challenge. Just prepare. Because if you make noise too early, ghosts disappear. In the meantime, intel confirmed the worst. There wasn't just one mole. There were 3. One in our logistics, feeding route timetables. One in tech, backdooring secure lines. And one, God help us, in training ops. They had been laying breadcrumbs for months, waiting to provoke a scenario where they could justify an extraction. Not of information. Of people. They wanted Ashfall. Not for intel. For leverage. I sat in my office that night with the file folder open again, photos of me, of Kincaid, of Reyes. They tagged us as assets. But the people targeting us didn't understand what that meant. We weren't assets. We were liabilities to anyone who underestimated us. I called Kincaid first. Voice only. You got backup gear cached? Always. You'll need it. Then Reyes. Library's getting loud, he said before I even finished dialing. Someone's been watching our systems. Time to close up shop. We decided on a meet point, just in case. Neutral ground. Old safehouse coordinates burned into memory from a decade ago. Then I erased every digital trace of our conversation. We would not be ghosts caught in the dark. We would be ghosts moving through it. That Friday, I stood in front of a packed training hall. Rourke introduced me. Captain Dunn will now brief you on the Ashfall Doctrine, he said. No names. No records. Just lessons that come at a cost most of us never had to pay. I stepped forward. No uniform fanfare. No titles. Just me. This isn't a story, I began. It's a warning. When you believe experience is outdated, you give power to people who sell theory over truth. And when you treat silence like weakness, you miss the ones who survived more than you'll ever see. They listened. Not because they had to. Because by now, they understood something that had taken years to learn. Silence doesn't mean surrender. It means readiness. And I was ready. Because soon, the fight wouldn't come with medals or flags. It would come with darkness. And ghosts. The safe house was exactly as we left it. Hidden beneath a disused ranger outpost just off the Wyoming border, tucked behind a shelf of collapsed rock only someone with the right eyes would even think to move. It smelled like old gun oil and silence. I arrived just before nightfall. Kincaid was already there, crouched beside the old comms box, a sidearm on her hip, and that same quiet fury in her eyes. Thought you'd never call, she said. I hoped I wouldn't have to. Reyes showed up 2 hours later, out of breath but unshaken, lugging a rusted duffel full of encrypted tools and handwritten notes. No one followed me, he said as he closed the hatch behind him. But someone sure tried. We didn't waste time. The room hummed with old energy, the kind you don't forget, the kind you never really leave behind. We mapped the pattern of attacks, analyzed the targets, cross-referenced timestamps. Within 2 hours, it was clear. We weren't the only ones they were hunting. Other units. Other ghosts. What started as a probe at Fort Harrow had evolved into something much larger, an operation to eliminate every off-record asset from the last 15 years. Anyone who had ever served in units like ours. Anyone who had done the dirty work quietly and walked away. They weren't just deleting us. They were deleting the proof we ever existed. We had a choice. Run. Or remind the world why we were created in the first place. Reyes looked up from his notes. We still got friends. Quiet ones. Embedded deep. Kincaid nodded. We light the fire now, or there's no one left to see it burn. I stared at the old sat phone. The one we'd used to call in that last exfil, 10 years ago. We make one call, I said. One call to bring it all to light. And then I did something I swore I'd never do again. I took off the patch, the black triangle with silver edges, and I laid it in the middle of the table. They stared at it, silent. Then Kincaid reached into her coat, pulled out hers, laid it down. Reyes followed. 3 patches. 3 lives that weren't supposed to exist anymore. I picked up the phone and made the call. The fallout was quiet. Strategic. Within 48 hours, an anonymous intel drop hit 3 agencies at once, exposing the rogue network. Internal moles were arrested under sealed warrants. The mercenary group dissolved like smoke in a hurricane. And the Ashfall name? Still unspoken. Still secret. But no longer erased. Back at Fort Harrow, they promoted Rourke to Joint Command Oversight. His last act on base was simple. He installed a plaque outside the training center. It didn't name me. Didn't name anyone. It just read. For those who served without glory, led without spotlight, and protected without question. Your silence built our safety. I never stopped wearing the emblem. Only now. I wear it visible, and every cadet who sees it knows something real. That history isn't always written in headlines. Sometimes, it's stitched quietly into fabric, and carried forward by those who never needed applause to prove their worth. We still don't tell the whole story. But if you ever see a black triangle with silver edges, know this. Ashfall isn't gone. Ashfall is watching. And we never stopped serving.